So I've just watched a radio show which has been broadcast on YouTube via the I newspaper. I read about the story and so I wanted to check it out. Basically, it was an interview, so-called, between Nigel Farage, the leader of UKIP, which is currently Britain's fourth biggest political party, and James O'Brien, the radio show presenter. This was on LBC Radio, which is a London-based radio station, and it often deals with political discourse. It didn't show it in this particular clip, which I'll give you a link to, but apparently one of Farage's spin doctors cut it off towards the end because he claimed that it was massively over time. Apparently Mr. Farage had agreed to 20 minutes, it was 21 minutes, so that sounded like an exaggeration. But I just want to give a few of my reflections on what I've just seen. My own position is I am absolutely not a UKIP voter. There's a lot of areas about UKIP I do not like. I'm not going to vote for them, and I'm unlikely to support them anytime soon. That having been said, I have to say this guy James O'Brien, and I know very little about him. I'm not a Londoner, I don't listen to the show regularly, but he just came across, frankly, as a typical smug leftist who wants to shout down anyone who disagrees and throw loaded terms around. That's how it came across to me. For one thing, the interview was more like an interrogation, because every single time that Nigel Farage tried to answer, this guy James O'Brien just cut off, interrupted with yet another allegation. And I'm not saying allegations are right or wrong, that's just rude, whatever way you look at it. And it can't be a fair interview under those circumstances, when the person being interviewed isn't given a fair chance to answer the question thoroughly. Also, it struck me that this guy James O'Brien, obviously he'd done his research, he was well prepared for the interview. The problem is that made it look very personal, and it looked like, rather than being a professional journalist with a balanced approach, he looked like someone who had a set agenda and who was just out to get Nigel Farage, in terms of just one allegation after the other. Now, there was points made on both sides I would agree with. I'm not completely against James O'Brien. I would say, for example, he raised some valid points about the hypocrisy of UKIP. Things, for example, like a lot of the xenophobic messages UKIP sends out against East Europeans, whilst Nigel Farage's own wife is German, therefore a European, and it's that certainly seems like double standards on the part of UKIP. But a lot of it was clearly typical of left-wing snootiness or left-wing insane political correctness. For example, Nigel Farage admitted that he felt uncomfortable on a train journey hearing none of the other passengers speak English. Now, I would feel uncomfortable as well if that was a train journey in the UK, and I think a lot of British people would. So for the interviewer to turn round and try and call that racist, I think was just odious, and it's typical of the left's attitude to the immigration debate. What they do is they use the R word to try and cite and it really pisses me off, because as soon as you use the R word, racism, that automatically destroys someone's character, and it doesn't give a fair and objective scenario for a debate. Because by using the R word, you automatically demonize someone, and that just, I think it's odious. I think it is absolutely human nature. If you hear lots of other languages in your country that are not the spoken language, the predominant spoken language of your country. I mean, look at it this way. If there was a group of Westerners, a large group of Westerners on a train in China, do you really think local Chinese people would feel okay with that? I very much doubt it. And similar examples could be made all over the world. It seems to me that when it comes to tolerance, there's this sort of attitude from the political left that we have to be tolerant, otherwise we're racist. And yet they don't look at examples around the world whereby national character is a very important part of integration, i.e. a national spoken language and reasonable attempts to fit into the crowd. Now, if you're always speaking another language in a country, then you're clearly not trying to integrate. And I would say the same for Britons who go to other countries and arrogantly speak English the whole time. I mean, I think it's just politeness to try and speak the language of the country that you're in. I'm not saying you have to be fluent, but I just think it's politeness. So the same logic should apply here. I do believe that people who want to live here for a long period of time should speak basic English. It's not racist to say that. For one thing, it helps them just as much as anyone, because it makes life easier for them. It helps them to integrate. For another thing, there's practical issues. If you have a general understanding that a national language is spoken, it makes communication a lot easier. That's just common sense. There's absolutely nothing racist about talking about that. So it really makes me... I mean, I'm an English teacher. One of my jobs is to help international students improve their English skills, which helps them, actually. So for the interviewer to call Nigel Farage a racist for having that feeling is just... it's odious, frankly. I mean, I remember I'd done canvassing years ago in the West Midlands, and there would be areas I would go into, I wouldn't hear a word of English, and yes, it did make me uncomfortable. The left is incredibly ignorant on this subject of immigration, because they don't see any problem with it. They see no problem whatsoever with a lack of assimilation or integration, because they take the rosy view, oh, we should all be different, it's nice and lovely and there's no problems associated with that. And they always say that when problems arise, it's because the far right stirs them up. Now, it is true the far right have a lot to answer for in terms of stirring up racial tension. There's no question about that. Wherever the BNP or the EDL go, they stir up trouble, and quite often that is based on lies and exaggeration. But to call Nigel Farage a racist and UKIP a racist party ignores the fact that, for example, they are calling for more Indian immigration to the UK. So I just think, I don't particularly like UKIP. In fact, that's an understatement. I really don't like UKIP. But I'm also increasingly seeing just how odious some of UKIP's opposition are. I mean, these people are extremists, some of them. They will stoop to the level of actually... I heard recently about a bomb being sent to UKIP headquarters. Now, why did that get very, very little attention? I saw it in one report. I forget the source. It was one report online, and then it's like it was just blown over. And I don't think it was made up. I looked at the material, and I think it was a reliable source. But I just think that this slander campaign that's clearly going on against UKIP, it's sort of the left-wing equivalent of what the right done to Gordon Brown in his last years as Prime Minister, well, in his short period as Prime Minister. You know, the right-wing press really slandered Gordon Brown to an extent that was just absurd. Now we're seeing the same thing with the left-wing press slandering UKIP. I mean, Nigel Farage in that interview laid out pretty clearly how he was going to have nothing to do with far-right elements, and O'Brien was picking up the most ridiculous points, like in 1981 or whatever it was, you had a meeting with someone who happened to be in the BNP. I mean, obviously, I do think it's important for journalists to have tough questions. I've no problem with that. What I had a problem with in this interview was there was just no scope for Mr. Farage to answer the questions and to respond, because the interviewer, so-called, just kept interrupting. I mean, it was ridiculous. So if UKIP wins in these elections, I hope they don't, because I don't like their policies, but if they do win, then a lot of these left-wing vigilante journalists are going to have to respect that decision. And this is another point I want to make. This goes across the political spectrum. We have a culture in this country of gotcha-style journalists. In other words, journalists whose sole interest is in trying to humiliate politicians. Solely for doing that. It's not about trying to bring about important subjects. It's solely about getting a gotcha moment, trying to put people on the spot, grilling them to the point of just humiliating them. Now, it's true that if he's a leader of a party, he should be able to handle it, but at the same time, I really think that this sort of vigilante-style journalism, which is usually very arrogant, very rude, is just... I mean, put it this way, if that was a political debate, i.e. if it was two political candidates, James O'Brien would be disqualified for just breaking rules. So it was much more like an interrogation than an interview. I'm certainly not saying he should give Nigel Farage an easy ride. I think tough questions should be asked, especially for a man who has aspirations to be Prime Minister of this great country. But that sort of journalism, I do think we have to question it, because press freedom is one thing, but we're getting to a point in the UK where we have a generation of journalists who just think they can do and say whatever they like. And they would say, oh, the politicians have to be accountable. My question would be, well, how about you being accountable and being a professional journalist who asks questions in a reasonable way, not always interrupting someone? Because this just struck me as typical of the arrogant element that you can find among much of the political left these days, which is shout down anyone you disagree with, brand them a racist, and that's it. And that's what was going on in this interview. James O'Brien just kept trying to shout down Nigel Farage, interrupting him at every moment, coming out with allegations, some of them true, some of them baseless, but the point is he wouldn't give Nigel Farage a chance to answer. And for me that's just... it's unfair, but it also actually is not an asset to democracy. It's not tough journalism, it's rude journalism. I think you can be a good reporter. An example I would give is Christiane Amanpour. She's an example of someone who asks tough questions but does it in a reasonable manner. And that proves that you can be a tough journalist and ask important questions and not let politicians get an easy ride, but at the same time do it in a reasonable way. Now what this guy James O'Brien was doing was incredibly unprofessional. It was just interrupting at every... And I'll put a link to the interview that you decide yourself. The comment section was pretty mixed. And just for the record, I'm really not a UKIP voter. I think there were some areas there that he pulled up Nigel Farage on which were legitimate. So it's not so much the questions he was asking, it's the way in which he was doing it. Although I do think, for him to harp on about racism, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Nigel Farage is a racist. So for him to vilify Mr. Farage's character in that way was odious. Really was. Also, I'd agree with Farage on one point. The left-wing media keep focusing on these sort of comments that come out of UKIP, and there is a lot of them. But Nigel Farage is right to say you can find similar things in every party, and he was right to say there is not the same level of scrutiny of the other parties. Now that is unfair. If there's going to be a grilling of what these idiots say, and there's no doubt about it, some of the comments are vile, they are definitely racist, definitely homophobic, definitely sexist, there's no question about it, it's not political correctness, those are what they are. But what Nigel Farage is saying is, yes, we have idiots in the party, but so do the Tories, so does Labour, so why are you not scrutinising them? And I think there he makes a valid point. So I'll put a link to this. Let me know your thoughts. I'm not a UKIP supporter. For example, in the debate with Nick Clegg, I 100% back Nick Clegg, because I think pulling out of Europe would be a serious mistake. Also, UKIP does have a track record of scaremongering. I mean, they keep talking about 500 million people could potentially flood the UK. Now, the point about that is, it's a theory, but there's no evidence to show it's going to happen. And Nigel Farage did say it's a potential situation, but the way UKIP promotes it is basically propaganda. Like, there's going to be a massive deluge of Romanians and Bulgarians. What UKIP is forgetting to say is that actually Britons can also work abroad. So I can go and be a teacher in the Czech Republic. Actually, I did have an interview a few years ago there. So it works both ways. It's not a case that there's all these East Europeans coming to Britain and we can't go there. A final point, the issue about immigration, and I don't have enough time in this video to talk about it, but Britain is actually more densely populated than China. We do need to have a controlled immigration system. And to any left-wingers who say saying that is racist, I would say get your head out of the sand. Get your head out of the sand. It's just stupid and nonsensical to try and argue that in a country that has a dense population, we're number 22 in the world by population, and density we're also pretty high up. We're higher than China. So it is entirely legitimate to question population in this country. It's entirely legitimate. For the left to say that's racist, clearly there's times when the right, elements of the right do turn it into a racist situation, when they start talking about ethnicity and so on. But there is a debate to be had about immigration, and the idea that there should be unlimited immigration is just, it's insane. And it's about time some of the left get their head out of the sands and realise that.